Joseph G. Bilby. Let me pull this down a little. Joseph is a Walltown resident. He received his BA and MA degrees in history from Seton Hall University, my husband's alma mater, incidentally. Mr. Bilby, who is Assistant Curator of the National Guard Militia Museum of New Jersey at Sea Girt, served as a lieutenant in the First Infantry Division in Vietnam, and has authored many books of military and New Jersey history. And according to our friend Jim Burster, I have to quote him. He said, "Nobody knows more about the history of New Jersey than Joe Bilby." Okay, some of the titles that he's written include, oh, I see. I don't have titles, but you've got a book, okay. And his books are in the back of the room, incidentally, for anybody that would like to purchase them. Joe? It's very warm in here. The air conditioning isn't working. If you're dripping like I'm dripping, that's why. They're having trouble with the air conditioning. So please bear with us all. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'm sort of dripping myself. Can you hear me in the back there? Okay, good. Because I don't like to use a microphone unless I have to. And now, how do I use this? Mr. Ranger. I push this one right here. Yes. Okay. I'm pointing in the right direction. All right. I'm best known as a Civil War guy, and most of the stuff that I've written in the past has been Civil War stuff. But one of my publishers, West Holland, asked me to do a book on the Battle of Monmouth. And since I only live about 15 miles away from the battlefield, and I've been out there a few times, and I knew something about the Revolution, I said, well, I can learn a lot more. And it just so happened that my daughter, who received her master's degree in history from Brooklyn College, had done her thesis on the Revolution in Monmouth County. So that gave us a little background material. So I signed her on to co-author with me. So between my military knowledge and her knowledge of the social and political history of the era, we were able to put this together. One thing to be remembered about the Battle of Monmouth is that it probably never would have happened had it not been for the French. With the French alliance, after the Battle of Saratoga, convinces the British that they have to redeploy their forces in America. Because right at that point, they're in Philadelphia. They've captured the capital of the United States. What happens? The people in the capital simply remove to the west, out to Lancaster. So the revolution is still going on. So they're in Philadelphia, and nothing much has happened, nothing much has changed. And then the French come in. So with the French in the war, now you have the threat of the French fleet out there. They don't know where they are. They also have to use some of the troops that they now have in Philadelphia to defend their possessions in the West Indies and in other places, and also to assume the offensive against the French in other places. So they have to cut the size of the available military. Now, they retrench, so they decide what to do in London is to move back to New York, which they have occupied since 1776. But they can only send so many people by sea from Philadelphia down to Delaware Bay because they don't know where the French fleet is. So because of that, most of the people they put on board ships are camp followers, but not all of them, as we'll see. Unreliable troops, some Hessians that they took might desert on the way across New Jersey, the sick, the injured, and they take them by ship to New York. The rest of the army, close to some 18,000 people altogether, decide to march across New Jersey. Now, in the first British entry in New Jersey in 1776, New Jersey was an ambivalent place. A lot of New Jerseyans, even militia officers, went and signed loyalty oaths to the British. But after they found out the British couldn't control their troops, and there was looting all over the state, they gradually turned against the British. So you have to see the militia turn out in December of 1776 to aid George Washington when he crosses the river and fights the battles of Princeton. So British counterinsurgency policy is one of the themes in the book. Stinks. They do not make friends with people. People come in and sign loyalty oaths, and it doesn't even matter. They're not worth the paper that they're signed on. But the British High Command tries to enforce this. They do not want their troops looting, but they have no control over them. So this belies the idea that the British Army was this very strictly disciplined group of people. What you have to remember is the British Army in 1775 was relatively small. The great expansion of troops in the British Army that takes place to fight the revolution, these are all new recruits. Now they're disciplined to do military stuff, but they're drawn from all different areas, and they're not the most reliable guys in the world when it comes to maintaining order. So this is a picture drawn of Clinton's Army Corps beginning to march across New Jersey. Clinton replaces Howe. And we'll say this for Howe, that he wasn't really overly enthusiastic about the revolution. It's not common, it's fairly common knowledge now. But he did have good taste, because one of the things he sold to Clinton before he left was a 50-pound wheel of Parmesan cheese. And it was, I guarantee you, it was Parmigiano Reggiano. It wasn't, it wasn't crap. Yeah. So we do know from that Billy Howe had very good taste. So you notice the Army here, you have a lot of women. Probably 8 to 10% of the military force in the Revolution was women, sometimes more. And they would perform, mostly the wives of the soldiers, sometimes not. The children also accompanied the Army. They performed all of the tasks like nursing and laundressing and even cooking. At one point, Washington said he wanted to get rid of all these women following the Army. And he decided against it in the end because he realized if he did, their husbands would simply desert. So you have a large contingent of women crossing New Jersey with the British Army. And there we have representative sample. Some of the artwork here was done by an artist, a New Jersey artist at Point Pleasant, Pete Koulos, who did this particular picture, who does Revolutionary and Civil War things. I'm lucky enough to get those pictures for the book. This is an officer of the 3rd New Jersey Infantry as he went along in 1778. He's got a uniform on, but that makes him, because he's an officer, he can afford a uniform. Most of the guys in the Continental line and the Jersey line, with which I'm most familiar, had bits and pieces of uniforms. They were initially uniformed in 1775, what they call the first establishment. They were enlisted for a year. They were all discharged in early 76. The new establishment was recruited. That included, God knows what, they got 32 Tories they were threatening to hang up in Morristown. They enlisted them. But they didn't really have regular uniforms until the French supplied uniforms around 1779-80. But they were wearing bits and pieces of civilian clothes. There were actually clothing drives over the winter of 1777-78 for the New Jersey Brigade. People were sent out to say, hey, do you have any socks? Or do you have, So in the French and Indian War, they recruited the Jersey Blues, and their bounty was $3 in a pair of pants. Say, hey, you're giving out pants down there. Let's join up. So he's, what he's armed with there is called a spontoon. So it looks like a spear. And when you take it and turn it sideways, you're behind the rank of men. You can keep them from lagging behind by pushing on them. So the NCOs and the officers have these spontoons. It's a badge of rank. It's also a weapon, though, if you look at it. And it can be used in lieu of a bayonet. Bayonets, by the way, another weapon that's commonly misapprehended. Very few people actually get stuck with bayonets in battles, unless they happen to be unfortunate enough to be laying in the ground when the other guys come over. Most of the bayonet killings in the Revolutionary War are night attacks. Paoli, Simcoe, Colonel Simcoe, the British Loyalist officer, Hancock's Bridge over the winter of 77-78 down in South Jersey, and the militiamen all fall asleep in this house, Judge Hancock's house. Hancock is a Tory himself. And in goes Simcoe's Rangers, who are, by the way, Americans, they're loyalists, and they bayonet everybody in the house, including the judge, who's a loyalist. Simcoe later on is told about this, and he says the 18th century equivalent of, well, stuff happens, what are you going to do? So, but the bayonet is a weapon intended to scare you into not being there when it arrives. And there's plenty of evidence for that written by surgeons in the 18th century and the 19th century. You see movies where guys are fighting with bayonets, and that doesn't happen. Okay. There's your average militiaman. You'll notice he's got a cartridge box on. It means that he's actually probably one of the guys who would be called into what they call the levies. When the campaign starts, there aren't enough men in the Continental Army, so they go to the different states, New Jersey included, and say, Virginia, I believe, was one, and Maryland, and Delaware, and they say, we want you to draft guys from the militia. Now, the precedent for draft is there. So when they draft guys from the militia, if you're being drafted, you don't want to go, you say, oh, I'll hire a substitute. And you find some 16-year-old kid, or that's how a lot of guys ended up in the Army, because this was, it was a job, something to do. But he's a typical militiaman. The militia in the Monmouth campaign provide a very valid, very good service to the American Army, because as the British begin to move across the state, the militia begins to harass them. Backing up the militia, Washington is sent across, once he finds out Philadelphia is being evacuated, he says, where are they going to go? Once he finds out where they're going, the Jersey Brigade, the regulars, are over across the river too, under Scotch Willie Maxwell. And what they do is harass the British from the moment they come out of what is now Camden, and work their way up Cooper's Landing in those days. Work their way up through Mount Holly. If you go down, if you want to follow the approximate route, Route 537, down in Burlington County now, is approximately, it's one side or the other, but that's the angle that they took. They went up through Mount Holly. Again, we had the problem of discipline. Clinton says, no looting, no burning. He says, as the Army leaves Cooper's Ferry, I will hang anyone I catch doing that. Well, they're no sooner out of Cooper's Ferry than they're looting and burning everything they get their hands on. In Mount Holly, they burned 3 houses down, and Clinton says, who did this? Well, I don't know. Junior officers are complaining that he's picking on them. So the British Army is ill-disciplined. They are stealing chickens, and they're cutting steaks off of cows and letting them die. It's just not the way to win friends and influence people. Now, the British Army comes into New Jersey in 1776, and what happens? People are running to sign loyalty oaths. I'm so sure about this revolution thing. They come in 1778, and everybody's shooting at them all the way up. The militia's out, and the militia's, they're dumping dead animals in wells and everything so they can't get drinking water. Interestingly, the Hessians, the British always blame the Hessians. They blame the Hessians for being the bad guys. And we have documented evidence, and I quoted in the book, from Hessian junior officers, where this guy said some of his men were missing, and he had been told, no looting. So he goes out and rams these guys up, said, get back to the line of march. Along the way, they come across a bunch of British guys carrying chickens and blankets. In the 1776 intrusion, the Quartermaster General of the British Army stole a living room set from Newark. What kind of an example is that, right? So that's what you get. So the militia is a very important attribute. They're not going to stand up and fight the British head on. This is Simcoe, that's an officer, Simcoe's Queen's Rangers. They're the guys who pulled the bayonet attack down in Hancock's Bridge, and they were also the people who begin the Battle of Monmouth. Simcoe, when they reach Freehold, they're going to say, where are we going to go? We're going to cut up to New Brunswick, we're going to go over to Sandy Hook. Simcoe claims in his memoirs that he had some guys from the area, because they were all Americans. And they told him, they gave Clinton the route to go out to Sandy Hook. That's the safer route. And his boys scout ahead of the Army, because he has what they call a legion. He has some infantry, he has some riflemen probably, and some mounted guys. Speaking of the militia, this is an actual battle run that may well have been present there. I got this battle run from my personal property. I swapped a guy a hunting knife for it about 30 years ago. He found it in a barn in Jackson Township. Now on the horn it says, you can barely make it out of the slide, Daniel denies. And on the butt it says DAD 1775. I'm on loan at the National Guard Museum at Sea Girt, and it is an original pattern. You know some rodents have been chewing on it from the barn. But I tracked the guys down, went to the David Library and found his pension and found that he was in a group known as Smock Slide Horse, which is Monmouth County Militia who patrolled the beach against the Loyalist raiders seeking to burn salt works down there in Monmouth. So that's an original artifact that may well have been present at the battle. And there's the base of it. It's a DAD 759. Now, the hero of the piece. Frederick Wilhelm von Steuben, and the von is, as most people know, looked into it, he sort of added that on just for, you know. He wasn't really a von. He was a sort of an itinerant army officer who had worked in several different European armies, but he knew how to drill troops. He happened to run into, I think it was Franklin he ran into, or someone like that in Paris, and said, look, you know, I'm looking for a job, I can do this, and he built himself up, and they shipped him over to the recommendation. He arrives at Valley Forge, I think in March of 1778, and what he does is, people have this image that he drills everybody personally in the Army. No, he doesn't. And he doesn't need to drill these guys on how to shoot, or how to load their guns. They know how to do all of that. There's a famous picture you see in your high school history book of Steuben, and he's got guys down on their knees and guys standing, you know, that's all. But what Steuben does is he takes all the different manuals. Everybody's trained to a different manual, in different regiments, in different states, and he synthesizes it into a simple manual so that everybody can move at the same speeds around the battlefield. So that way there's a coordination here. And then he drills exemplar guys who go back and drill their own units. He's not working at this long. He didn't get there till March. He can't speak English, so they assigned him, I think it was Lawrence, who spoke French, and he interprets, so he curses in German, and Lawrence curses in French, and then they turn it into, you know, they're going back and forth. He can speak French, I'm sorry. He curses in French to Lawrence, Lawrence puts it in English, and away they go. But very important guy. And he actually begins a battle of Monmouth too, because when Simcoe's men are out there scouting in the vicinity of today's freehold, the courthouse, they run into a militia patrol and some mounted American troops with Steuben. And in the encounter, Steuben takes off because he didn't want to get captured and loses his hat, which I think Simcoe picks up as a souvenir. But here's a statue of Steuben out at Monmouth battlefield. And there's another statue of Steuben, and there are many of them around. But he is an important guy. And he's significant, not because he taught these guys the basics, they knew the basics, but because he coordinated them. Now you have 2nd New Jersey Infantry. You see this guy he's got a brown coat, probably civilian coat. This is about how they would have looked at the time of the battle. He's got his musket. He happens to have a British musket, brown vest, but actually most of the American troops at Monmouth have been re-equipped with new French muskets. And some of them, for some reason, didn't like them. And they threw them down and picked up brown vests that the British had dropped. Why, I don't know. Looking at it from my own viewpoint as a person who shot all this stuff, I prefer the French design. But the musket ball the British gun shot was heavier. Maybe they thought that was more significant. We also know a lot of buckshot. And here's Charles Lane. He's the centerpiece, and not an attractive man. I don't know that he looked exactly like that. That's the ugliest representation of what you find. And, it's generally agreed he wasn't an attractive man. He was, and people know the Lee story. I'll just recapitulate it a little bit. He was a guy who thought he should have been in charge of the Army, because after all, he was Charles Lane. And he had come over here, he'd been a British Army officer, and he was jealous of Washington, and you know the whole story. And then, of course, he gets captured up here at Basking Ridge while he's, having a cocktail or whatever in the afternoon. Who are you? Fancy this, my old regiment, Yeah. They take him into Washington, to New York, where he tells the British, this is the way you can defeat the Americans. Then he's been away from the Army for a couple of years. He returns in the spring of 1778 to Valley Forge, and Washington has a big parade for him. I'm sure Washington knows he's a bum, but at the same time, he doesn't want to be accused of anything. So what does Lee do? He goes and he takes off immediately to go to the Congress to lobby for him replacing Washington. But he comes back, and the story, after the Americans realize the British are crossing New Jersey, they move up and they cross at Coriolis Ferry, which is Lambertville today. And as they're doing so, Washington has the idea. He has a couple of councils of war along the way. Now, the British are crossing New Jersey to go to New York. What are we going to do? We get involved in a pitched battle with these people, says Lee, who's now back in the Army. They will defeat us because the Americans don't know what they're doing. Well, he is not familiar with the Army. He's not familiar with what Steuben has done. He hasn't been with the Army 2 years. He's with them, remember what it was like on Long Island, in 1776. It's a different Army now. At the same time, what he says does make some sense. Washington is taking a middle ground. He does not want to commit to a major battle. At the same time, he realizes that this could be a very good publicity deal here, and we could hurt the British Army. We could test our troops without putting everything on the line, because they are retreating. So that is what he decides to do, and he assigns Lafayette to the front, to the forward element of the Army, and basically he's saying, check your opportunities out, see what they are. Lee sees there's so many guys up there, he says, I want that command by seniority. So Lee then assumes command of the vanguard, which ends up in the morning of the 28th of June around the town of Englishtown. And he does not know what's in front of him. He has no idea what's out there. He doesn't know what this lay of the land is. But he begins to advance in the early morning, hoping, he thinks he sees a chance to cut off the British rear guard. The British march in 2 divisions. They have 1,500 wagons with them that they have to get out of New Jersey too, plus all the women and children. The rear guard is the elite troops of the British Army under Cornwallis, and it's light infantry and grenadiers, and these people are some of the best of the British. But Lee sees that he thinks a chance to cut them off. But when he starts moving the troops forward, he doesn't even know who they are. After a while, he says to one officer, one thing, who are those guys over there? They're ours. Oh, okay. And he doesn't really know who's where. And they're spread out in different brigades. Nobody knows what's going on. What are we supposed to do here? And then the British turn and fight. And Clinton sees this. When General Clinton sees this, he's with the rear guard. He calls more men down from the First Division. He sees a chance now to defeat a large section of the American Army and destroy it. He won't say this later on, but this is what he sees. And so Lee is blundering around out there, and the Americans begin to retreat because the Jersey Brigade is here, and they see these guys, where are those guys going? They're going back there. Maybe we should go back there too. So they all start falling back. And it just becomes, they're not running or anything, they're just falling back. And then the famous scene occurs. Washington comes up. And you have Alexander Hamilton and Lawrence, the staff officers, who are telling him, something bad's coming on here. And Washington moves up to meet General Lee on the field at Monmouth. Now, what are these people armed with? That's the standard British musket. That's a long land pattern, 75 caliber with a bayonet. It fires a ball that's around actually 69 caliber, encased in a paper cartridge with about 110 grains of black powder. That is an American rifle. Most of the Americans are armed with smoothbore muskets. The American rifle is this mythology during the Revolution. The Americans hid behind trees and popped the guys with rifles. Well, the weakness of the rifle was that they had but there were no riflemen at Monmouth because Daniel Morgan had his own riflemen. There were light infantry units armed with rifles, especially for the Virginia unit regiments. Washington detached them all and gave them to Morgan. Morgan sort of got lost and sat down on the road south of Freehold and never entered the battle. And that's one thing Washington did too. A lot of these units that he was sending into the front guard there, the vanguard of the Army, were ad hoc units. He would say to a brigade, you give me 10 of the best guys from each company, and then we'll put them together. And he made these ad hoc units up. Now you would think this is not going to work because these guys don't know each other. But the plus part of it was they'd been drilled by Strobel, so they all now were working on the same sort of drill. So that was an advantage. Washington was big on making up ad hoc units of what he thought to be elite troops. So that becomes very confusing in Monmouth because when you look at the commanders and you see, oh, this guy commands such and such regiment, but he isn't at Monmouth. He's commanding another group of guys from the New England regiments or something like that. Yeah.
When you say that's a rifle, it's got a rifle bore?
It's got a rifle bore.
So it's very accurate.
It's accurate, yeah, up to, well, maybe in a real good shot, 150 yards, on 200 on the man. No further than that. Smoothbore musket, deadly under 50, and actually, if you're firing a whole bunch of them, you don't want to be 100 yards away, because they will hit you somewhere. Especially if they were buckshot in the cartridges, which the Americans had to do. Now this is another interesting weapon that may have been used at Monmouth for the last time in the Revolutionary War. There was a man named Ferguson, Captain Ferguson, Paddy Ferguson. He sort of invented breech-loading rifles. You see, you can twist the breech and pour powder, put the ball in, okay? He didn't really invent it. That Chemek, the French guy, but Paddy made a little change and called it his. And he had 100 of them made, and he had a rifle company with these breech loaders, which would have a higher rate of fire than muzzle loaders and be accurate because they were rifle. And so he went over and they actually fought at the Battle of Brandywine, but they actually got pretty badly shot up by guys with muskets, and Ferguson himself got badly wounded in his arm and was useless. I've actually shot one of these, a reproduction, not the original. There's only a few. You have an original here, of course. And I think this is it. Next picture. Yeah, there it is. You see where it's repaired down there in the bottom and broke. Now, there's a couple guys I know that just came out with a book in which they praised Ferguson. They did a lot of shooting with it. Their conclusion in the end, though, is much different than mine. That it's not really a revolutionary weapon because the British couldn't make them. You know, it took them like 6 months to make 100 of them. So, you know, there was no way they were going to arm the whole army with them. And they were very expensive. And they did say they could get 2 rounds a minute out of it, or 6 rounds a minute. The average musket got 3 rounds a minute. So the difference is, you know, more accurate. But anyway, there may have been a Ferguson or 2 at Monmouth. We know there were rifles because the archaeology of the battle finds in one of the fights at the end of the day, they found in recent years a bunch of 60 caliber round bullets, too small for either musket size. But about rifle, now the guys who found them thought they'd have to be American. No, they're not. Because the unit that was deployed in that area were the Highlanders. And every Highland company had about 6 or 7 rifles. Yeah, so another thing that a lot of people don't know. And they were British bullets. It did prove the Highlanders were good. Here's your paper cartridge. One of the top is 4 buckshot, and then a ball underneath it, and then powder. The bottom is just a ball and powder. They bite the end off, prime the pan, insert the rest of the cartridge paper and all, ram it down, fire. So you get 3 rounds a minute that way. That's fairly rapid fire. That's an original one. You can see it's wrapped in newspaper. Paper was not that common a commodity in those states, so you know, they recycled newspapers to make the cartridges. It's one of the very few original cartridges I've seen. It's not mine, the ones that a friend of mine has collected. That's Coriel started where the Americans crossed, as it looked in 1778. But here's the thing, the scene that we were just alluding to. A lot of people think that Washington meets Lee on the battlefield and then he relieves him of command. He doesn't. He just basically says, and there are all these stories about the trees shook from the profanity and Washington was capable. Basically, though, all the guys that tell these stories about all these terrible oaths that Washington swore, they were nowhere near the place. The only guy who was near there said, basically, he says to Lee, what's going on here? You know, translated into modern. What's this about? Why are those guys going there? So he says, I'm disgusted. He says to Lee, take charge of the defense, and then Washington goes back to set up the artillery on the ridge above. And Lee actually does a credible job of putting together a defense at a place called the Hedgerow. If you go down the battlefield today, you'll be able to see, you take a walking tour. It's one of the very best preserved Revolutionary War battlefields. The topography is slightly different because of 19th century farming practices. But the streams are still there, Middlebrook, and they're all still there. The hill that they went up on is still there. But they drained the marshes that were there. And there were more shoe-sucking, literally shoe-sucking marshes the day of the battle. Guys ran through there and their shoes were pulled off. And it was also like 100 degrees or 110 degrees. So people were dropping. Some say more died from the heat than musketry. Now the British are pushing back the Americans and they overrun 2 lines. But the Americans retreat in order and cross over the stream. The British chase them over the stream, led by Colonel Monckton of the Grenadier Guards, and they run into a blizzard of fire on the other side from artillery and musketry, and they're driven back. They leave Monckton dead on the other side of the stream. I mean, this is unheard of. Leave the commanding officer of the Grenadier Battalion, who's a big deal, and his body remains there through the whole battle. They never get it back. So that in and of itself is evidence that they really took sort of a pace in here. But Lee himself, after the rest of the Americans are driven across the stream and the main line is drawn on Perrine Ridge, Lee himself goes to Washington and says, "What do I do now?" Washington basically goes, "Get lost." And then he goes back to Englishtown and starts thinking about how badly he's been treated. And this is about what, you see these movies and the British are always like powdered wigs and stuff like that. This is basically what the guy would look like. This is 15 Regiment Foot, this is a Don Coriani print. You notice his coat is cut very short, and he's got his musket, he's got his cartridge box, he's got a pair of leggings on, there's no stockings and paneling and all that stuff. And his hat is even, the brim of his hat is cut. So they were trimmed down, and they didn't go shoulder to shoulder. They called it the American Scramble. They were at least this far apart, and they moved very fast. So if you're in the American line, and the light infantry's coming, and suddenly they veer off that way, and they start running, you better get out of there, because if there's no one over there, they're going to be on your flank and behind you fast. So they're moved, the idea is, especially the elite, the grenadiers, the light infantry, move fast, scare them with a bayonet, and they'll take off. So, but the grenadiers went into heavy fire from the Americans. They did this on Long Island and got away with it. They'd flank the Americans, scare the hell out of them, and off they'd run. There'd be a stand-up fight for a few minutes, and then boom, the Americans would collapse. Doesn't happen anymore. One of the reasons it doesn't happen is extraordinary. This is a Highland. Black Watch, that 42nd Foot that fought in the apple orchard at Monmouth on the right flank, the British right flank, the American left. Again, this is a pretty tough looking customer, and they had a number of, again, rifles per company, which a lot of people are not aware of. They think, oh, the Americans used rifles, the British didn't. No, they had rifles. Well, most of them muskets. Now, this is a stylized 19th century thing. This is what the movie thing looked like. So this guy's got like the wigs and, they have the gators and all that. But it is a fair representation of what happens down by the stream. That the Americans fall back and they go up the ridge, the Grenadiers run across, and that's where they lose Monckton, and then they retreat. If they had done that, we have stalemate for most of the rest of the day. And then towards the end of the day, Washington gets some artillery piece up in Combs Hill that outflanks the British line. It's an artillery duel, basically. The battle becomes an artillery duel. That's what we have a multi picture. But the artillery duel doesn't resolve itself. Washington decides at the end of the day he's going to push back on it. So he pushes, Wayne goes forward on the right flank, and the New England light infantry on the left. And engage in some fighting, and Wayne is driven back, but they all, they hold it. Then Clinton has decided. Now, Clinton thought that he was going to take these guys and rout them. At this point, he said, well, I'm going to just cut my losses and get out of here. And so when the night comes, off they go. They hit the road to Middletown. Meanwhile, the militia has been harassing the column on the road to Middletown. But they get up to Middletown Heights, and Washington has, in essence, offered them what Lee had originally called for, which was the so-called Bridge of Gold, which is an 18th century military terminology. It says, give them an escape route, and then you can claim victory. So they do. But Clinton claims victory too. He claims, I accomplished my mission. But there's two letters from Clinton we found. One letter is the public letter, in which he says, I accomplished my mission, I beat off their attempt to take my rear guard, blah, blah, blah. There's another private letter he wrote that's in an archive in England that says, basically, this didn't turn out as well as I thought it would. Can I go home now? So he said, this is not going to do better. So, now, buried there, and then you see the street. If you go to Creole today, you go to the tenant church, which is behind the lines. There's a lot of stories that this was used as a hospital, and there was, the blood is still on the pews, and that it's because the furniture stand somebody dropped it, in 1920. But you really don't know. Anyway, they have grave markers here. And here's Henry Fauntleroy, who was killed by a cannonball at the Battle of Monmouth. And he's a Virginia officer, captain. And then you have Monk, that's tombstone for Monkton. And then for Joshua Huddy, who was lynched by the British sometime prior, or sometime afterwards. We don't know that any of those guys are buried there. They're buried somewhere in the church there. And then there's another one that says mass grave, something. The interesting thing is, if you look at 19th century culture and 18th century culture regarding people killed in battle, they're entirely different. In the Civil War, everybody wants closure. They want to find out where their loved one is buried. Clara Barton forms the missing soldiers office in Washington after the war. It's ads in all the newspapers. If you know a comrade was killed and buried somewhere, a historian comes along in 1830 or so, and he says, where'd they bury the dead for this battle? And an old farmer says, well, when I was a youngin', and the grass used to grow real green over there, so probably over there. Nobody, that's it. They said there's a bunch of British guys buried underneath the Rita's lemon ice in downtown Freeland. Nobody's looking for it. But there's a whole different, it's an interesting and different approach, I think. Yeah, especially having dealt with the Civil War so much. And now the iconic Molly Fisher. The biggest bogus story is that she's promoted to captain on the field by Washington himself, who looks like he's 80 years old when he's like 45 or something like that. And we have a great Don Troiani print down at the National Guard Museum when I have kids come through the tour. I said, look at it, Washington and Princeton. Look at this guy. I said, this is the guy on the dollar bill that's like a grandmother. This is how we really look. But anyway, there she is, Captain Molly. Then the two legends get intertwined. There's Molly Corbin, who they actually did give a sort of semi-captain's commission to and a pension, and she's buried up at West Point. But the woman at Monmouth existed, I'm pretty sure. And we figure it's Molly Hayes, Molly Ludwig Hayes, Mary. And there's another, this is her cigarette card in the 19th century. She becomes a symbol of that. This is the painting that's down at the park now. And there she is again, on the picture. And this is probably the best representation. Again, this is a Troiani print. And there's a statue of the grave of Mary Hayes Macaulay, and her second husband's name was Macaulay, in Lancaster. It's Carl. And after the battle, what happens? 1830s comes, people try to raise money to put up a monument. It's just a small plinth about this big. They can't. Nobody wants to contribute. That's interesting. 50 years after the battle, the first commemoration. And there's a letter to a Trenton newspaper in which this guy says, as a young man, I served as a subaltern in a regiment out on the field, and this commemoration was a disgrace. He said, all it was a thing put together to promote Andrew Jackson for president. Nothing politics, nothing around. Not until Joel Parker comes along, who's the during the Civil War, and then later was judge in the New Jersey Court of Appeals. Parker makes Freehold, he makes a personal cause out of getting the monument together. And there it is today. But in 1878, they have an anniversary, big deal, finally, 100 years, and he starts to raise money. It takes him 6 years to get the money, even then, to get this up. When you look at the bottom, there's a great bronze relief by a sculptor from New York named Kelly. And there's there are different incidents in the campaign, Washington's Council of War, and one of them is Molly Pitcher. The guy standing next to Molly Pitcher is Thomas Edison. Because Kelly was a friend of Edison's, and he was looking for a guy without a beard in 1880, you know, because he wanted a model. So he said, Edison would be my model, and Edison is on the I found that out through the biography stuff. This is the first Colonel Monckton memoir. That was how it was in 1878. And there's the church right today. This is 1928, 150th anniversary, 114th Infantry Division, New Jersey National Guard, marching through Freehold. And then every 25 years since, they've sort of they've done some. This is the big 1978 reenactment. We found a lot of pictures of this down in the museum, and there's the National Guard with support troops there. There they are. Like 1978 National Guard guys with, like, you know, long hair and mustaches. One, a guy off, a reenactor, who's actually a member of the 3rd Infantry. And there they are. There's the fat National Guard colonel with a cigar in his mouth, talking into the ambulance. It was as hot that day as it was the original day. I know we're there. I was actually trying to get there as an observer, and I couldn't get there. There was a huge traffic jam. But they do a commemoration every year. And again, it's a well worth seeing battlefield. It's being marked more nicely now. And the walking tours that they have, the little handouts are very good. So I will conclude on that. If anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. Yes?
I understand that most of the British soldiers in America were actually Irish because they were not content with starving at home, so they joined.
Well, I wouldn't say that necessarily, but yes, most of the British Army in the 19th century was Irish. You know, a lot of them were. You got people in England too. They used to hold. I describe it in the book how they used to recruit. We have a whole chapter on recruiting in both armies and how they got men together. And they used to do the same thing. They'd have a party and hand out booze. And then in England, they give them the king's shilling. So, oh, you took the king's shilling, you're in. Yeah. So, yeah, a lot of them, a lot of the Germans over here deserted, especially as the war went on. Yes.
If the Americans had won on that battlefield, wouldn't that have won the war?
Perhaps, but that was impossible. If they had, there were 18,000 British troops altogether, counting the guys on the way to Monmouth. And Washington did not have the offensive capability to do that. He knew it. So he got the best deal he could out of it. And I consider it a victory. Because number one, they stood up to the best of the British, the light infantry, the grenadiers, and stopped them. And Clinton decided, well, maybe I'm not going to do this anymore. And if you know what was in Clinton's mind, it makes it clear that it's an American victory, because Clinton was hoping to nail the wall. And it didn't work anymore.
But what if they had chased them to Sandy Hook and caught them there, up against the water?
They didn't have enough, they would have had to get there. They would have had to go through 18,000 British troops.
And the Navy would pick them up.
And a British fleet that was sitting there in Sandy Hook.
170.
I don't think it's tactically possible.
No.
I think Washington knew it was tactically possible, and he did it. Now, that's not to say that thought didn't cross people's minds. Even Scotch William Maxwell, the Brigadier Brigade commander, who was no slouch, he said, oh, maybe we can Burgoyne them. That was his phrase. But I don't think it was possible. There's another question, Rick?
Well, my question was similar. If the British ended up going up Sandy Hook or to Round Bay, how were they going to get back to New York?
They did. That's what they did. They went to Sandy Hook.
But the British Navy got?
Yeah, they had boats and everything right there. They went to Sandy Hook. They got on the boats and they went right up into And Washington moved his army further north. Now, along with it goes Lee. Lee demands a court-martial. He demands a court-martial. Now, if he had just kept his mouth shut, he might have got a good duty somewhere, you know. But no. He demands, now, he knows that most of the officers in the American Army, led by Hamilton and Lawrence, who are Washington's aides, hate him. But he's such a windbag that he demands a court-martial. All the guys in the court-martial hate him. And he has to know this, but he's so vain that he can't figure it out. And indeed, he gets court-martialed and suspended from the Army. Which is, you know, Washington says, I had nothing to do with it. It's his fault. Washington's probably dancing a little dance in his tent. Got rid of this guy. And that's the end of Lee's career. He dies before the war is over. He goes back to Virginia where he has a property, and he goes up to Philadelphia to lobby again in Congress, and then he dies. I mean, the guy didn't have talent. He was a guy who went to Manhattan in '76, said this is indefensible. He was right. He was the guy who set up the British initial defenses at Charleston, and they held. He was also the guy, if you think about it, who had the line that eventually formed after he screwed up in the first part at Monmouth, that enabled Washington to get his guns and everything, of course, Peron Ridge. Yeah.
The British retreat after the battle, they head toward Middletown.
Yes.
And that's pretty well defined. But after they get there, don't they kind of fan out the way to Sandy Hook?
They pretty much directly go. The militia are all around. They stay on the roads.
Is that road,
Yeah.
markers there?
There are markers here and there. I don't know how accurate they are today, because the roads, of course, you know, there weren't very many roads in those days. King's Highway in Middletown. Yeah, they stuck together because they had to, because the militia hung on the flanks. The militia was attacking the wagons up there. They never captured it. That's enough to give the British credit. They didn't lose one wagon out of 1,500 crossing New Jersey, and the roads weren't very good. They got them all won. So give them credit for that. Yes.
Monmouth is a state battlefield. Why do you think it never became like a national battlefield, national military?
They tried. In the 30s, they tried. When Morristown became a national park in the 30s, this is, I guess, I may be wrong, but this is one of the first national military parks.
The first.
Yeah, it's the first, yeah. And they saw this down in Monmouth County, and guys who were interested tried to get the same thing from Monmouth, and the federal government refused to consider it. Didn't do it. And then, eventually, it's going to become a housing development. And the state saves it. We have that story in there, too, about one guy who worked for the state, saved it under the Green Acres program that just passed. Yeah.
What's the state of the archaeology?
Interesting. They've done a lot of it there. I mean, that finding of the rifle balls over by the orchard, they've been able to, it's always been very vague as to where everybody was there. And they've been able to really firm up the lines better as to who was where. But finding those rifle balls over there confirmed what we thought, that the Highlanders were in there. But they thought it was Americans, but I said, no, that's the Highlanders. They weren't fired, they were drops. Yes?
Are there accurate statistics for deaths and casualties?
Casualties and stats are all over the lot. People made them up. I would say probably about 400 people died that day. A few hundred wounded, maybe more. You know, they're claiming 1,000, you know, but they're just wild claims. The one guy we thought we had reliable because he kept a list of the number of people murdered, number that varied, and then the park historian, very knowledgeable guy, said, I found that guy to be, you know, he futzed around with figures and other things, so we don't know. But I know they put 10 to a wagon and bury them 10 to a hole. Yes, sir.
Lee of the Bible of Monmouth, is he a relative of Robert E. Lee?
No.
No.
The other Lee, White Horse Harry, was the disreputable White Horse Harry, which is what made Robert E. such a goody two-shoe. Because he was a crazy guy, you know, man. White Horse Harry. You have to give him a debtor's prison or something. Scammed George Washington out of the land. He was quite a character. That happened with some New Jersey colonel, too. He ended up living on land and not paying his rent to George Washington. Shreve, from Shreve, the famous Shreve family, the grandson down in Shreveport, Louisiana. But the colonel moves out to, after the war, moves out to Portsmouth, Pennsylvania, or Ohio, someplace. He's living on the Native Pocket. Any questions? Okay, well, thank you for your attention.
I'm sorry we're all so sticky. Well, now it's my pleasure to introduce somebody that I really don't know very well, who is going to do the trivia for you tonight. Guess who?
Couple things. Don't forget, please, when you, I'll use this. Before you leave, do not forget to turn in your name tags. Okay? After the last meeting that we had in September, a woman came up to me and she said, "Oh, I feel so bad. I didn't know the answer to a single question. So I'm wondering if I'm making these questions too difficult." I've dumbed them down a little bit.
That's Brewster.
So I don't want anybody leaving here feeling bad that they didn't know enough about the American Revolution. All right, I'll name 8 battle sites, and you tell me if General George Washington was present at the site. Now don't blurt out your answer, let's give everybody a guess. Okay. The first one was Saratoga. No? Just think about it. All right, don't shake your head. The second one was Bunker Hill. No. The third, thank you.
It's a reflex.
The third is Yorktown. The fourth is Monmouth. The fifth is Cold Harbor. The sixth is Trenton.
Yes.
Seventh is Princeton.
Yeah.
And the 8th is Kings Mountain.
No.
Okay. Okay, I heard what you said out there, despite what I admonished you. Saratoga, he was not present. Who were the two commanding officers that said the battle of
Benedict
Saratoga?
Arnold and Gates Arnold.
Right. Benedict Arnold and Gates. Bunker Hill? Was Washington president of Bunker Hill?
No.
No, he had not even been appointed yet. That happened 2 days later. Appointed as the head of the army. Yorktown.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, of course he was present at Yorktown. The Battle of Monmouth, if you weren't listening tonight. Okay, now how about Cold Harbor?
Wrong word.
Wrong war. That's the Civil War. Okay, I thought I'd check you out, but I didn't. Trenton?
Yes.
Of course he was present. Princeton?
Yes.
Yes, he was present at Princeton. Kings Mountain?
No.
No, he was not. Okay. What was the purpose? Now this may seem simple, but some people don't realize it. What was the purpose of the invasion of the Massachusetts countryside by British troops in April 1775, which resulted in the battles of Lexington and Concord? What were the British troops after?
Ammunition.
Arms and ammunition, which they had a rumor that there was a cache of say, cannonballs and rifle ammunition and powder in Concord. Thank you. Okay. What treatment did Virginia doctors administer to a fatally ill George Washington in December 1799, which probably hastened his death? They bled him with leeches. Which incidentally was the standard treatment at the time. Following the American victory at Yorktown, Lord Cornwallis declared himself too ill to attend the surrender ceremonies, and he sent his second-in-command to represent him. Washington likewise sent his immediate subordinate to accept the sword of surrender. Who represented Washington?
Benjamin Lincoln.
Benjamin Lincoln is correct. 5. To whom was Benedict Arnold married at the time he defected?
Peggy Shipp.
Peggy Shipp, the pretty daughter of a prominent Philadelphia merchant. Arnold was about twice her age, incidentally. Why was was British Major John Andre executed by hanging instead of firing squad, which is what he requested, after his capture of the plans of West Point's defenses in his boot? He was declared a spy. He was not in uniform. Okay. He made a terrible mistake of wearing civilian clothes. Next, British military uniforms were red. Americans wore dark blue and buff as the general uniform color. What was the color of Hessian mercenaries' uniform?
Blue.
No.
Blue.
Green is correct. How about French infantry? White. Okay, which is a pretty impractical color of it. Okay. Where was the treaty signed which ended the Revolutionary War in 1783? Paris, France. Very good. In Edwin Lloyd's 1851 heroic oil painting of Washington's Christmas crossing of the Delaware, there were several factual misrepresentations. Name one of the most glaring.
The flag.
The flag. The flag. The standard was not changed to the actual standard that the flag of the boat represents until over a year later. Okay. Okay, here's one. In 1764, before the Intolerable Act began, an issue arose in the New England colonies that almost sparked a full-scale rebellion against the Crown, well before the battles of Lexington and Concord. What was the issue?
Stamp Act.
No? Anybody? Okay. I didn't think you were going to get this one. By parliamentary law, the British Admiralty forbade the New England colonists from harvesting any white pine trees because the wood was deemed to be the sole property of the Crown to be used as masts for the British Navy ships. For their part, the outraged colonists almost staged a revolt, and they continued to harvest the pine trees regardless of what the British did. Thank you very much. You did pretty well.